Joining us now for Word Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya, our Ijebu princess. Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Rubin. Good morning, Ayo. Good morning, Rufai. Thank you. That's very kind of you, very sweet of you all. Good morning to viewers. Let me tell you what's happening around the world. Now, US President Donald Trump has extended the African Growth and Opportunity Act, popularly known as AGOA. That was after it was left in doubt last year when his administration allowed it to expire, essentially, while enforcing his policy of reciprocal tariffs. You remember when that happened. Now, Trump signed the extension into law on Tuesday, which continues until the 31st of December this year, giving eligible sub-Saharan African countries duty-free access to the US market on some products. So let's take a closer look at what we are talking about essentially here. So AGOA, as I said, was introduced actually back in 2000 under former US President Bill Clinton. And as of early 2026, there are 32 sub-Saharan African countries who benefit from it. So that it includes the likes of Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and Angola. But as I said, many countries. Now, the United States can remove countries that fail to meet requirements for participation. So that includes establishing market-based economies or really upholding democratic standards and human rights issues. So for example, Uganda was actually removed from AGOA back in 2024 by the Biden administration because at that time it had enacted a very strict anti-gay law, which the US recognizes as a human rights violation. So just to give you some context on what AGOA seeks to do. Then moving on, we do know that AGOA does drive much of the trade between the United States and the African continent, which was valued at more than $100 billion back in 2024. That's according to the US Trade Office. Now, the agreement, AGOA itself, does allow some 1,800 products to be exported into the United States. These are, of course, also duty-free, and they include things like crude oil, vehicles, car parts, clothing and textiles, and agricultural produce. Now, if we move on and take a look at perhaps these African countries in and of themselves, you do know that Nigeria and South Africa are, of course, Africa's largest economies. But both countries have had recent strains on their relationships with the United States. If we're looking at what happened in South Africa, we do know that Washington applied a 30% tariff on them last year. And that was after unsubstantiated reports of white minorities in South Africa being persecuted. And then when we're looking at Nigeria's cause for strain with the United States, previously that was due to allegations of there being persecutions along religious lines, Christian persecutions and the like. So it is quite clear that as it stands, AGOA is quite a substantial act here, but it has faced its challenges. So moving on now, perhaps if we continue on with this, we can take a look at our next story. And we're looking at, again, the Epstein files, but this time we're looking at it within the African context. So the latest release of these files linked to Jeffrey Epstein does include a reference to former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. Now, what we are seeing is that emails released do show correspondence, contact between Epstein and a former MIT, that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Media Lab Director, a man by the name of Joichi Ito. They were discussing a proposal about providing Zimbabwe with a new currency. Now, in one of these exchanges on emails, Ito asked whether Epstein was friends with Mugabe himself. Now, Epstein replies and says that he was not, but that he could easily get his attention, describing Zimbabwe as a great petri dish. Now, the files also reference South African former President Jacob Zuma in separate correspondence linked to a social dinner arrangement with really no allegation of any criminal wrongdoing. And that's as many names continue to be released to be, involved in these Epstein documents. Now, we do have to make clear that inclusion does not imply guilt or any wrongdoing. And these emails do reflect what we've been seeing, what's been released by the Department of Justice over in the United States. So when we're looking at Africa Africa, funnily enough, and these Epstein files, they do go on to talk about many issues, but I can see that we've got a next story up there. So perhaps we'll move on to our last story in the World Brief this morning. And we are talking about Savannah Guthrie. She is a co-host on NBC's flagship Today show. It is their version of the morning show, essentially. And she's released a very emotional video on Instagram alongside both of her siblings. And they are calling for proof that their mother, 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, is alive. That's after their mother was reported missing from her Arizona home. Now, authorities believe that Nancy may have been abducted and describe her fragile health, limited mobility, and urgent need for medication as being causes to really let them know where she is and share her status as it stands. Now, reports of a ransom note is being investigated by authorities, though its legitimacy at this point hasn't been publicly confirmed, not to the wider public or to the family themselves. But no suspect as it stands has been publicly identified. We do know that Nancy Guthrie was last seen by her family at her house near Tucson, Arizona on Saturday night. And she was reported missing the following day after a family member received a call from a member of her church saying that she did not attend church service that day. Now, after the family statement, Donald Trump, US President, did say on social media that he spoke with Savannah Guthrie on Wednesday and was deploying all resources to get her mother home safely. In addition to that, you do have other heavy hitters in the US government, the likes of Pam Bondi, who is, of course, the Attorney General, also speaking with Guthrie, and then also the FBI Director, Kash Patel, saying that he would travel to Tucson, Arizona himself. So a very, very disturbing story happening there. We do hope that her mother is released safe and sound as soon as possible. Well, let's take a look at our newspaper headlines from across the world. As ever, we begin with the front page of This Day in Nigeria. And This Day does have a multitude of stories, but on the front page, we do know that This Day is leading with news that the Senate has essentially rejected mandatory real-time electronic uploads of election results. Now, lawmakers instead, they've decided to increase the fines for electoral offences. They've replaced the card reader with the bimodal voter accreditation system, BVAS, and they've also adjusted election timelines, drawing criticism really from opposition parties and civil society groups for essentially what they say undermining electoral transparency. Well, This Day also reports that the federal government has clarified that US troops deployed to Nigeria are really limited to training and intelligence support. They're not actually combat operations. These aren't boots on the ground in that essence. The deployment was requested by Nigeria, and it is part of ongoing cooperation between both countries to combat terrorism here in Nigeria. So let's move on to our next paper. We've got the Daily Trust. And the Daily Trust, again, moving on from that, is talking about this insecurity, another example of it. So we are seeing that over 130 people were killed in coordinated attacks by gunmen in Kwara, Katsina and Benue states within 48 hours of each other. In Kwara state, at least 100 residents were killed in a prolonged bandit attack on Woro community, also in Kayama local government area, with dozens of houses and shops razed and many women and children abducted. In Katsina state, 20 people were killed, at least 20 people were killed in separate attacks on Doma communities, that's in Faskari local government area, following the collapse of a local peace agreement as authorities blame the violence on reprisal attacks. Let's take a look at the Daily Sun, because following on from This Day's lead story talking about the Senate, the Daily Sun also weighs in on this and says that the Senate reduced the election notice period from 360 days to 180 days and cut deadlines for party nominations and submissions of candidates lists to 90 days. The Senate has also, as we previously said, increased fines on vote buying to 5 million naira while retaining the 2022 electoral provisions on electronic transmission of results. Well, we've got the Daily Independent up next, and the Daily Independent reports that the federal government has unveiled the Nigerian National Cancer Control Plan covering 2026 through to 2030, and a new nuclear medicine policy to boost cancer prevention and care. That is obviously in the aftermath of World Cancer Day yesterday. To the New Telegraph this morning, the New Telegraph does report that the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, Limited, NNPCL, has shut down the Port Harcourt refinery, describing the $1.5 billion rehabilitation project as a monumental loss. No way, Jose. Well, the group chief executive officer, Bayo Ojulari, said that the refinery continued to drain national resources despite crude supply and partial utilization. I think many people could have seen that coming a long time ago. Moving on to the United Kingdom's papers, we've got The Guardian this morning, and it is a very, very tough few days for the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Reports from the UK Guardian do say that Labour MPs have warned that Sir Keir Starmer's days as Prime Minister are numbered as anger continues to grow in Parliament over the last few days over the choice and lack of scrutiny in appointing Peter Mandelson as US Ambassador. It was Keir Starmer who brought him back into government. Now, the I-Paper also weighs in on this. Sir Keir Starmer, according to their reporting, has been left isolated and on the ropes as he loses the confidence of a number of Labour MPs. And then we have The Sun. The Sun is also focusing its front page on the ongoing Epstein trial. Not really trial, the file scandal, and claims that staff are striking at Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's new home, refusing to work for him. So just a very turbulent time all round.
Phenomenal class act by Kevin Garden.
The producer says there will be no chat.
That's
the way he wants it. That's how he wants it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.